Mikel Moreno built an empire with his bare hands. A car bomb took the lower half of his body. He fired every nurse who ever pitied him. Then Serena showed up. 20 minutes late, broke, driving a car that died at his gate. She didn't flinch. She didn't tiptoe. She ripped the blanket off his legs and said, "If you wanted a maid, you should have hired one." He'd never been talked to like that in his life. He hired her on the spot. He had no idea she was about to become the only person standing between him and a room full of wolves. The Moreno estate wasn't a house. It was a fortress with a body count. Wrought iron gates, cameras on every corner, men with guns, pretending to be gardeners, and rolling up to all of it. Serena Alica, in a dying Honda Civic, 3 eviction notices deep, with nothing left to lose. She didn't know she was walking into Mafia territory. She just knew the pay was triple rate. She had no idea the man inside hadn't let anyone touch him in 6 months. The humidity of the late afternoon clung to Serena Alica's skin like a damp wool blanket, but it was nothing compared to the icy, dead weight of the fortress looming ahead. Her 1998 Honda Civic sat exactly 3 feet outside the sprawling wrought iron gates, letting out one final, pathetic hiss of steam from under the hood before dying completely. Serena slammed her forehead against the steering wheel, accidentally triggering a dying, choked honk from the horn. "Perfect," she muttered to the empty dashboard. "Absolutely brilliant timing." She hauled her oversized tote bag off the passenger seat, hearing the distinct, ominous crinkle of the 3 eviction notices resting at the bottom, alongside a half-eaten bagel and her vaguely legitimate nursing certificate. Stepping out of the car, she was immediately pinned by the cold, unblinking stares of 2 men standing on the other side of the gate. They wore tailored black suits that cost more than her entire student loan debt, but it wasn't the fabric that caught her eye. It was the heavy, bulky shape of shoulder holsters stretching the fabric beneath their arms. "I'm here for the interview," Serena called out, hiking the slipping strap of her tote higher onto her shoulder. "The caregiver gig. Unless you guys are the ones who need a nanny, in which case I'll just walk backward into traffic right now." The guard on the left didn't even twitch a muscle in his jaw. He unclipped a sleek radio from his belt, murmured a few brief words, and the massive iron gates clicked open with a heavy, mechanized thud. Serena walked up the mile-long driveway, her rubber-soled boots squeaking rhythmically against the pristine asphalt. The Moreno estate wasn't a home. It was a fortress, masquerading as a mansion. High stone walls topped with razor-sharp detailing hemmed in the property, while security cameras swiveled with quiet, motorized hums, tracking her every step. The thick oak front doors looked like they had been ripped off a medieval cathedral, built to withstand a battering ram, or worse. The moment she stepped into the foyer, the door clicked shut behind her, cutting off the humid afternoon air and replacing it with a chill that smelled intensely of lemon polish and stale cigar smoke. "Hold it right there," a voice grunted. A man stepped out of the shadows of the cavernous hallway. He was built like a brick wall, with a nose that looked like it had been broken at least 3 times in various alleyway disputes. "Frankie?" Serena asked, guessing based on the agency's brief warnings. "Bag," he demanded, extending a massive, calloused hand. Serena handed it over without an argument. Frankie didn't just look through it. He systematically inverted her life onto a marble-topped side table. With brutal efficiency, he confiscated her pink canister of pepper spray, her heavy keyring, and a rogue bobby pin she didn't even know was loose. He patted down the sides of her canvas tote, checking the lining for hidden compartments with the practiced ease of a prison guard. "Hey, easy on the bagel. It's tomorrow's breakfast," she muttered, crossing her arms over her scrubs. Frankie didn't laugh. He stepped closer, instructing her to raise her arms. His hands patted down her sides, checking her waistband, the pockets of her oversized scrubs, and even the collar, where a faint coffee stain from breakfast still lingered. The clinical, heavily armed nature of the house settled over her like a physical weight. There were no family photos on the walls, no warm colors, no signs of life. Every corner of the grand foyer radiated a cold, calculating paranoia. This was an empire built on violence, and even with its king confined to a chair, the wolves guarding the perimeter were entirely bloodthirsty. Frankie swept her keyring back into his pocket, keeping her pepper spray. He pointed a thick finger down the dim, cavernous hallway. "Down the hall. Last door on the right," Frankie grunted, his voice scraping like gravel. "Don't touch anything. Don't look at anything you aren't supposed to." "Right. Standard hospitality." "Got it," Serena said, reclaiming her thoroughly ransacked bag. As she walked away, her rubber soles let out a loud, obnoxious squeak against the polished marble floor, echoing through the dead silence of the mansion. She checked her watch. She was exactly 20 minutes late. She was broke, completely out of options, and about to face the most feared man in the city with a coffee stain on her chest. Stopping in front of the heavy double doors at the end of the hall, she didn't bother to knock. She figured she was already disqualified anyway. Taking a deep breath, Serena gripped the brass handle and pushed the door wide open. The vast room was dominated by a massive mahogany desk, but the man wasn't behind it. He sat by the window, silhouetted against the light. Mikel Moreno was an imposing figure, even seated in a state-of-the-art motorized wheelchair. Broad shoulders stretched the fabric of a dark, unbuttoned dress shirt, and a sharp jawline covered in a shadow of stubble twitched slightly as the door swung open. A heavy wool blanket was draped meticulously over his legs. He didn't turn around. "I explicitly said I wanted the agency's senior representative," Mikel said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated in the quiet room. "You breathe too loud, and your shoes squeak. It's the rubber soles." "OSHA compliance," Serena said, dropping her tote bag onto a leather armchair. It landed with a heavy, ungraceful thud. Mikel finally turned the chair, the motor whining softly. His pale, icy eyes swept over her with brutal efficiency. He registered the messy bun, the coffee stain on her collar, and the slight tremor in her hands. "You're not a senior nurse," he stated flatly. "I have my credentials, and I have references." "Well, one reference, but she really likes me," Serena said, crossing her arms. "Look, Mr. Moreno, you fired the last 4 nurses the agency sent. Word is, you're impossible to work for. You throw things. You refuse physical therapy. You insulted a woman so badly she cried in the driveway." "She treated me like a toddler," Mikel said, his tone entirely devoid of apology. "She spoke to me in a pitch usually reserved for golden retrievers. I don't need a mother." "Good, because I barely kept a succulent alive last week," Serena shot back. Mikel's eyes narrowed. He rolled his chair forward. The movement was smooth, but Serena noticed the white-knuckle grip he had on the joystick, the tight tension in his forearms. He hated the machine. He hated relying on it. It radiated off him in waves of suffocating anger. "Why are you here?" he asked softly, the kind of quiet that usually preceded violence. "I need the money," Serena said. Honesty was the only card she had left. "You pay triple the going rate. I have rent due and a car that just died at your gate. I don't care if you're an irritable bastard. I can lift you. I can monitor your vitals, and I won't use a baby voice. In exchange, you sign my paycheck." Mikel stared at her, the silence stretching long enough for the ticking grandfather clock in the corner to sound like a sledgehammer. Slowly, he reached over to a side table, picking up a crystal tumbler filled with amber liquid. His hand trembled slightly, a residual nerve issue from the explosion that took his legs. The glass slipped. It hit the hardwood floor, shattering into dozens of sharp fragments, splashing expensive scotch across the polished oak. Serena didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. It was a blatant, degrading power play, and they both knew it. She looked down at the mess, then looked back up at the Mafia boss. "You missed the rug," she noted. Mikel's jaw tightened. "Clean it up." Instead of dropping to her knees, Serena walked over, her rubber soles squeaking deliberately. She bypassed the broken glass entirely, stepped right over it, and stopped directly in front of his chair. Before he could guess her move, she leaned down, grabbed the heavy wool blanket covering his dead legs, and yanked it completely off. Mikel reacted on instinct. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with crushing force. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he snarled. Serena didn't struggle against his grip. She just looked down at his exposed legs. They were thin, the unmistakable signs of muscle atrophy setting in over the last 6 months. "You're hiding under a blanket in a 70-degree room," Serena said quietly, meeting his furious gaze. "If I'm working for you, I need to see what I'm working with. You have pressure sores starting on your left calf, your circulation is poor, and if you squeeze my wrist any harder, I won't be able to push your chair." He let go. He looked at her with a mixture of shock and sheer rage. No one touched him like this. No one addressed the reality of his broken body so bluntly. His previous nurses had hovered and pitied him, trying to pretend he wasn't half dead. "You're hired," Mikel said flatly. "Frankie will show you your room. Clean up the glass before you go." "I'm a caregiver, Mr. Moreno, not a maid," Serena said, stepping back and slinging her tote over her shoulder. She turned toward the double doors. "Tell Frankie to bring a broom." She shut the heavy doors behind her, stepping out into the hallway. Leaning her back against the cold wall, she closed her eyes, and finally exhaled a shaky breath. She had the job. Now she just had to survive it. 2 weeks later, the reality of the job set in. It wasn't just checking vitals or administering nerve blockers. It was the crushing daily grind of managing a human body that refused to cooperate with its owner's commands. It was 3 a.m. The compound was dead quiet, save for the rhythmic, violent sheets of rain lashing against the bulletproof glass windows. Serena sat in the corner of Mikel's expansive bedroom, reading a paperback by the dim, warm light of a small desk lamp. A sharp, sudden intake of breath from the massive bed broke the silence. Serena dropped the book. She was by the bedside in 3 seconds. Mikel was awake. His chest heaved in jagged, shallow breaths. His hands gripped the silk sheet so tightly his knuckles were bone white, and his jaw was locked in absolute agony. "Spasm?" Serena asked, her voice instantly dropping into a low, entirely professional register. He managed a single stiff nod. The nerve damage from the severed spinal cord didn't just cause paralysis, it caused vicious phantom pains, violent muscle spasms that twisted his dead legs into knots he couldn't feel, but somehow still agonizingly experienced in his brain. Serena threw the heavy covers back. His right leg was jumping, the thick muscles contracting violently and visibly against the bone. "Okay, I've got you," she said. Without a shred of hesitation, she climbed onto the edge of the mattress. She placed her hands firmly over his thigh and calf, applying heavy downward pressure. She leaned her entire body weight into it, using every bit of her frame to fight the violent, chaotic jerking of his leg. Mikel squeezed his eyes shut, his head rolling back into the pillows as a harsh, guttural groan tore from his throat. He hated this. He hated being seen like this. Weak, writhing, completely at the mercy of a girl who didn't shrink away from his anger. "Breathe, Mikel," Serena instructed, the urgency erasing any formal titles. "It won't stop if you fight it." "Stop," he gritted out through clenched teeth, sweat beading rapidly along his forehead and dripping into his stubble. "It will. Give it a minute." She adjusted her grip, the physical exertion immediate and immense. His leg was heavy, dead weight animated by chaotic electrical signals. "Talk to me. Distract yourself. Tell me why there are 3 locked rooms on the 2nd floor. None of your business," he rasped, his eyes bulging slightly from the strain. "Fine. Keep focusing on the pain then." "Great strategy," Serena shot back, pressing harder. A harsh, breathless laugh punched out of him, sounding more like a dry cough. "Guns, cash, archives." "Archives?" She shifted her palms to maintain traction. "Fancy word for blackmail, I'm guessing?" The spasm began to peak. The leg jerked violently, throwing Serena off balance. Her arm slipped, her elbow catching him hard right in the ribs. "Shit, sorry," she hissed, scrambling to reset her footing on the mattress and pin the leg back down. Mikel let out another breathless, broken sound. "You're a terrible nurse." "I warned you," she said, bearing down on his shin with everything she had. "You hired me anyway. You get what you pay for." Slowly, agonizingly, The violent jerking began to subside. The rigid muscles unclenched beneath her palms, and the leg went limp again, returning to a state of quiet, still flesh. Serena didn't move away immediately. She stayed kneeling on the bed, her hands resting lightly on his shin, feeling the chaotic pulse of his nerves finally settle. The only sound left in the room was their ragged breathing and the relentless rain hitting the glass. Mikel opened his pale eyes, looking up at her. She was wearing an oversized, faded band t-shirt and flannel pajama pants, her hair a tangled mess on top of her head. There was no pity in her expression. She was simply waiting to ensure the spasm wouldn't return. "You can get off my bed now," he said quietly. Serena released his leg and slid off the mattress, pulling the covers back up and smoothing them out with clinical efficiency. "You need to up the dosage on the baclofen," she said, walking over to the corner sink to wash her hands. "The spasms are getting more frequent." "No, the pills make my head cloudy." "I can't run a business with a cloudy head." "You can't run a business if you haven't slept in 3 days, because your legs are doing the Macarena all night," Serena said, drying her hands on a towel. She turned to face him, her voice softer but unyielding. "Take the pill, Mikel. I'm not going to sit here and watch you suffer for the sake of your ego." Mikel stared at the ceiling, the sheer, profound exhaustion showing on his face. The Mafia boss, the man who ordered hits with a flick of his wrist, was just a tired man trapped in a broken body. "1 pill," he muttered. Serena smiled softly, a genuine quiet expression. She prepped the medication, handing him the small paper cup and a glass of water. He took it without another word of complaint. "Get some sleep," she said, turning off the bedside lamp. "Serena," his voice stopped her just before she reached her armchair. She turned in the gloom. "Yeah? Thank you." It was a barely audible whisper, a massive concession dragged out of him. "Don't get sentimental on me, Moreno," she replied dryly, sinking into her chair and pulling her own blanket up to her chin. "It's in my contract." But as she closed her eyes, she knew the lines were already blurring. He wasn't just a paycheck anymore. The dim gloom of the master bedroom swallowed the remaining hours of the night. Serena didn't sleep. She sat in the heavy leather armchair, her eyes tracking the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of Mikel's chest in the shadows. The medication had finally knocked him out, but the air in the room still felt thick, charged with the lingering electricity of his agony and that single, whispered concession. When the first pale ribs of dawn finally cut through the bulletproof glass, Mikel stirred. The transition from sleep to hypervigilance was instantaneous. His eyes snapped open, pale and instantly sweeping the room until they locked onto her. Serena was already on her feet, her joints popping as she stretched. She walked over to the bedside table, picking up the empty water glass. "Morning, sunshine," she said, her voice dry and thick with a caffeine deficit. "Your color looks better." "Head cloudy?" Mikel shifted, pushing himself up onto his elbows, with raw upper body strength. His jawline was tight, the dark stubble shadowing a stark expression. "I feel like I've been hit by a truck." "That's just what a full night of sleep feels like to a stubborn bastard," Serena said, setting the glass in the sink. She walked back over, unceremoniously pulling the duvet down to inspect his alignment. "How are the nerves?" "Quiet," he muttered, though his eyes burned into her with a defensive edge. He hated the vulnerability of the morning, hated that she knew exactly how much weight she had to throw around to keep him pinned the night before. The pill was an anomaly. Don't expect it to become a routine. Serena paused, hands on her hips, looking down at the man who ran the city's underground. "An anomaly? Mikel, you were vibrating hard enough to shake the floorboards. If I hadn't been here to pin that leg, you'd have torn a muscle or thrown your hip out of alignment. Your ego is going to land you back in the ICU, and frankly, I don't want to fill out the paperwork." Mikel's expression darkened. "You forget who you are speaking to, Serena." "Oh, right, sorry," she said, her tone dripping with mock realization. "The terrifying Mikel Moreno. The man who orders hits with a flick of his wrist, but is currently throwing a tantrum over a tiny yellow tablet because he's afraid it makes him look human." For a second, the silence in the room was suffocating. The air grew cold, the kind of quiet that Frankie usually warned her about. Mikel's forearms flexed, his fingers digging into the silk sheets. He looked like he wanted to break another crystal tumbler, or her neck. But Serena didn't blink. She just stared right back, her unhinged, blue-collar confidence acting as an impenetrable shield. Slowly, the rigid tension in Mikel's shoulders dissipated. The terrifying Mafia dawn bled away, leaving behind the exhausted, broken man trapped in a body that wouldn't listen. He let out a long, ragged breath and looked toward the window, where the morning sun was finally burning away the rain. "You are incredibly irritating," he said, his voice dropping back into that low, gravelly register. "I'm a professional, Mikel," Serena corrected softly, her tone finally losing its sharp edge as she reached over to adjust his pillows, ensuring he was supported properly. "And professionals don't let their patients suffer just to protect their pride." He didn't argue. He didn't look at her either, but as she turned to go fetch his breakfast tray, she caught the faint, barely perceptible nod of his head. The boundaries between boss and employee had officially shattered in the 3 a.m. dark, and neither of them knew how to build them back up. The syndicate didn't pause for paraplegia. Serena learned this the hard way on a Tuesday afternoon. She was in the kitchen, aggressively trying to scrape burnt eggs off a non-stick pan when Frankie walked in. He looked severely stressed. "Boss needs you in the study," Frankie said, leaning his massive frame against the door frame. "It's not time for his meds, and he's in a meeting," Serena replied, scrubbing harder at the stubborn grease. "Yeah, well, the meeting ain't going good. He buzzed me, said to bring you in." Serena frowned, dropping the sponge. She dried her hands on a towel and followed Frankie down the cavernous, quiet hallways. The atmosphere in the mansion had been thick with a choking tension since early morning. Fleet after fleet of black SUVs had rolled through the heavy iron gates, discharging men in dark, tailored suits with hard faces. Frankie pushed open the heavy double doors to the study. The room was thick with a dense blue cloud of cigar smoke. Mikel was behind his mahogany desk. Across from him sat 3 men. Serena instantly recognized one of them from the intelligence dossiers Mikel sometimes left carelessly on his nightstand. Wyatt, a high-ranking lieutenant in the organization. Wyatt was a broad, bull-necked man with a jagged scar slicing through his left eyebrow. He looked furious. Mikel, on the other hand, looked completely unbothered. He was leaning back in his wheelchair, steepling his tattooed fingers. But Serena knew his tells now. She saw the tight cord of muscle straining in his neck. She saw the rigid, unnatural posture. The men stopped talking the second her rubber soles squeaked into the room. Wyatt turned, his cold eyes raking over her stained scrubs. "This a joke, Moreno?" Wyatt asked, a sneer curling his upper lip. "We're discussing the port shipments, and you call in the nursemaid?" Mikel ignored Wyatt entirely. He looked directly at Serena, his pale eyes flaring with a sudden, intense command. "Serena, my legs are aching," Mikel said smoothly, his voice a low baritone. "I need my stretches." Serena blinked. Stretches? Now? He hated physical therapy more than anything. He avoided it like the plague. She caught the minute, desperate flash in his gaze. "Play along. Sorry I'm late." The kitchen sink backed up, Serena lied smoothly, walking around the large mahogany desk. She felt the hostile, dangerous eyes of the 3 mobsters tracking her every move. This was a dominance display, and she was the pawn, though she wasn't sure yet who was playing who. "We're not done here, Mikel," Wyatt growled, leaning forward and placing his heavy hands flat on the desk. "The word on the street is that you're weak. The Italians are encroaching on the south side. They think because you're confined to that chair, you can't push back." Mikel didn't flinch. "The street talks too much, Wyatt. I run this family from the neck up. My legs have nothing to do with it." "With all due respect," another capo muttered, cutting through the smoke. "Respect requires a show of strength. You haven't left this house in 6 months." Serena knelt beside Mikel's chair, her heart hammering against her ribs. She unlatched the heavy footrests. The silence in the room pressed down on her like a physical weight. She took Mikel's right leg, dead, heavy weight, and lifted it into a stretch. "You're doubting my capability to lead," Mikel said softly, his voice devoid of anger, which only made it 10 times more terrifying. "We're saying the men need a leader who can stand with them," Wyatt pushed, clearly emboldened by Mikel's lack of movement. "Maybe it's time you stepped back. Let someone else handle the day-to-day." Serena felt Mikel's thigh muscle twitch beneath her hands. It wasn't a nerve spasm. It was a violent, suppressed urge to lunge across the desk and tear Wyatt's throat out. But he couldn't. He was anchored to the machine. The sheer humiliation of the moment hung thick in the air. Wyatt was staging a soft coup, banking entirely on Mikel's physical vulnerability. The wolves had cornered the king, and they were ready to bite. Wyatt leaned in closer, his shadow stretching over the polished mahogany desk. The smell of stale cigar smoke on his breath was suffocating. "Look at yourself, Mikel," Wyatt sneered, his voice dropping to a harsh, mocking rumble that echoed off the high wood-paneled walls. The great Mikel Moreno, reduced to needing a little girl to lift his feet for him. The other two capos in the room shifted uncomfortably, but neither of them spoke up to defend their boss. They were watching, waiting to see if the rumors of the king's decline were true. "You used to break skulls with your bare hands," Wyatt continued, his scarred eyebrow twitching with a cold, superior amusement. "Now, if a fire started in this room, you couldn't even make it to the door without someone pushing your joystick. The streets know it, the families on the south side know it. They're laughing at us, Mikel. They see a cripple on the throne, and they see an open target." Mikel's expression remained carved from ice, but beneath Serena's hands, his leg was rigid with a terrible, silent tension. His fingers gripped the armrests of his wheelchair so tightly that the leather groaned under the pressure. The humiliation was thick, heavy, and entirely deliberate. Wyatt wasn't just questioning his leadership. He was stripping away his dignity in front of his own men, trying to force him to break. "A leader needs to be feared, Mikel," Wyatt said, his voice rising, carrying the dangerous weight of an ultimatum. "They need to see a man who can stand on his own 2 feet and bleed with them, not a man who hides behind high stone walls and wool blankets. It's time to face reality. The chair makes you weak. It's time to step down before someone decides to make the vacancy permanent." Serena didn't think. She just acted. She stood up abruptly, dropping Mikel's leg, which hit the padded footrest with a dull, heavy thud. She turned to Wyatt, wiping her hands on her scrubs. "Excuse me," Serena said, her voice piercing through the heavy, masculine tension of the smoke-filled room. "Are you a doctor?" Wyatt blinked, entirely thrown off guard by the chaotic girl in the stain-covered scrubs addressing him. "What? Are you a neurologist? An orthopedic surgeon?" Serena stepped around the massive desk, completely invading Wyatt's personal space. She was a foot shorter than him, but she carried the absolute, unhinged confidence of a woman who regularly negotiated with predatory utility companies to keep her lights on. "Because if you're not, I suggest you shut your mouth about Mr. Moreno's physical condition." "Listen here, little girl," Wyatt started, his face flushing a dark, dangerous red. "No, you listen." Serena snapped her fingers, jabbing the air an inch from his chest. He survived 2 pounds of C4 under his chassis. His spinal cord was completely severed. By all medical logic, the trauma should have killed him, or at least left him a vegetable. Instead, he was awake and dictating orders to his lawyer from the ICU 4 days later. The room went dead silent. Frankie, standing by the door, let out a very quiet, smothered cough. Mikel watched her, utterly motionless. Serena didn't stop. She was running on pure defensive adrenaline. "The man's pain threshold is higher than your IQ, and he operates on 4 hours of sleep and nerve blockers. He doesn't need to stand up to run you. He could run this entire operation from an iron lung. Now, you can either sit down, shut up, and talk about the port shipments, or you can leave so I can finish his medical care. Because frankly, you're raising his blood pressure, and I do not have the patience to deal with a stroke today." She glared at Wyatt. Wyatt glared back, his jaw working as his eyes darted from Serena to Mikel. Mikel finally smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp expression that didn't reach his pale eyes. "You heard the nurse, Wyatt," Mikel said softly. "My blood pressure. Sit down." The tension broke. It didn't dissipate, but it shifted entirely. Wyatt slowly sank back into his leather chair, his soft coupe utterly deflated by a girl with a coffee stain on her collar. The heavy silence that followed Serena's outburst didn't lift. It simply reorganized itself around her. Wyatt sat rigidly in his leather chair, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack, while the other two capos carefully avoided looking at him. Mikel, however, looked entirely in his element. The physical vulnerability Wyatt had tried to weaponize just moments ago evaporated, replaced by the terrifying, cold aura of a man who ruled by intellect and fear. He leaned back in his motorized chair, his tattooed hands resting calmly on the armrests. "The south side is mine," Mikel addressed the room, his tone quiet, but carrying a lethal, authoritative weight that brooked absolutely no argument. "If the Italians want a war, they can have it, but we don't bleed onto the streets like amateurs. We choke their supply lines." He unlocked his gaze from Wyatt and glanced down at his desk, tapping a thick finger against a map of the harbor. "Wyatt, you're going to the docks tonight. You will personally oversee the shifting of the cargo containers from berth 4 to the secure warehouse. If a single crate goes missing, or if the Italians so much as sniff those manifests, I will consider it a personal failure on your part. And you know how I handle failures." Wyatt swallowed hard, the dark red flush on his neck fading into a tense, sickly pale color. "Understood, boss," he muttered. His previous bravado completely vanished. As the men quickly fell back into line, taking precise orders from the man in the chair, Serena kept her head down. She knelt back down by Mikel's leg, her hands shaking violently now that the defensive adrenaline was beginning to crash. She hid her trembling fingers by pretending to thoroughly massage his cold calf muscle, focusing entirely on the slow, rhythmic stretching she had used as her cover story. She had just inserted herself into the volatile, deadly politics of a criminal syndicate. She had made herself a target. But then, Mikel's hand shifted. Moving away from the armrest, his large, heavy hand came to rest lightly on her shoulder. His fingers squeezed just enough to anchor her to him, a fleeting but undeniable gesture of approval. In front of a room full of wolves, the boss had just marked her as his, protected, essential, and entirely untouchable. A collective, unspoken shift ran through the capos. They looked at Serena differently now, no longer seeing a chaotic nursemaid, but a permanent fixture at the right hand of the throne. As Mikel continued to systematically dissect the Italian's logistics, Serena kept her eyes on his dead limbs, her heart hammering a fierce, erratic rhythm. She was surrounded by killers in a fortress built on blood, but with the steady weight of Mikel's hand grounding her, she realized something utterly terrifying. She didn't want to be anywhere else. The adrenaline crash hit Mikel exactly 3 hours after the capos left the estate. Serena heard it before she saw it. A low, muffled curse echoing from the master bathroom, followed instantly by the heavy, sickening thud of dead weight hitting expensive tile. She dropped her inventory clipboard, her rubber soles screeching against the floor as she sprinted down the hallway. Mikel was on the floor. He had tried to execute a solo transfer from his wheelchair to the shower bench, a maneuver he usually managed through sheer, stubborn upper body strength. But the exhausting stress of the afternoon meeting had completely drained his reserves. His arms had given out mid-move. Now, he lay half-propped against the cold porcelain of the bathtub, his legs tangled uselessly beneath him at an unnatural angle. The water was running, rapidly filling the room with a thick, suffocating cloud of steam. Serena didn't gasp, and she didn't ask if he was okay. It was a stupid question, and Mikel despised stupid questions. She walked past him first to turn off the water, cutting through the loud roar of the showerhead, before kneeling directly on the wet tile beside him. He was breathing hard, his bare chest rising and falling in jagged, ragged rhythms. His eyes were squeezed shut, his jaw clamped tight enough to crack molars. The humiliation radiating off him was almost radioactive, thick and suffocating in the small space. "Left leg is pinned," Serena said, her voice dropping into that clinically flat, unbothered register. "I'm going to straighten it out first. Tell me if the hip catches." "Don't." Mikel ground it out through clenched teeth. He opened his pale eyes, and for the first time since she had walked into his fortress, they weren't filled with icy dominance. They were burning with a raw, agonizing mixture of vulnerability and sheer fury at his own broken frame. "Call Frankie. Get out. Frankie isn't here, and I'm not leaving you on the floor," Serena said calmly. She reached down, ignoring his rigid posture, and carefully unknotted his twisted limbs, smoothing his legs out onto the tile. "You can glare at me all you want, Moreno, but you're a 200-pound man of solid muscle, and neither of us is getting you back into that chair if you keep fighting me." Mikel let out a harsh, broken breath, his head dropping back against the edge of the tub. The mask of the terrifying Mafia Don had completely slipped away, washed down the drain with the steam. Here, on the wet bathroom floor, there was no empire, no syndicate, and no room full of wolves to command. There was only the unvarnished reality of his condition. "I had them fooled," he whispered, a bitter, self-loathing laugh scraping past his lips. "They think I'm a monster, and I can't even take a damn shower by myself." Serena paused, her hands resting firmly on his shoulders to stabilize him. She looked directly into his eyes, refusing to let him look away. "They think you're a leader because you shut down a coup from a mahogany desk. You don't need a shower bench to prove that." Slowly, she shifted her weight, hooking her arms securely under his arms to prepare for the lift. "On 3, Mikel. Use your arms. Let me take the weight." He didn't argue this time. He nodded, his fingers digging into her shoulders for leverage. Together, with a synchronized, exhausting surge of strength, they broke through the heavy gravity of his paralysis, sliding him back up into the state-of-the-art chair. As Serena stepped back, panting slightly and wiping the damp hair from her forehead, Mikel reached out. He didn't grab her wrist with crushing force this time. His hand simply rested over hers for a brief, quiet second, his pale eyes holding hers in the dimming steam. The masks were gone. The armor was stripped away. But as Serena squeezed his hand back, she knew they had found something entirely unbreakable.